Hello, this is Chris, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Friday, July 5th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Let's start with the front page. U.S. and Israel voice new optimism about ceasefire as Gaza talks resume. A senior White House official called progress in talks with Hamas a breakthrough, while Israel was more restrained, and both said major obstacles to a truce remained. By Aaron Boxerman, Michael D. Shear, and Thomas Fuller. American and Israeli officials on Thursday expressed renewed optimism over a ceasefire deal in the Gaza Strip after Hamas revised its position, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel then told President Biden that he was sending a new delegation of negotiators to the stalled talks. White House officials said they believed new progress in the talks amounted to what one repeatedly called a breakthrough in the months-long negotiations, though they said that it would take some time to work out the many steps involved in implementing the truce. Israeli and other officials involved in the talks agreed that there had been progress, but described it in more cautious terms. The discussions are based on a three-stage framework deal publicized by President Biden in late May and endorsed by the United Nations. If carried out, the agreement would ultimately stipulate an end to the war, a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, and for Hamas and its allies to release the remaining 120 living and dead hostages in Gaza for Palestinians held in Israeli jails. A senior Biden administration official directly involved in the talks said that there was broad agreement now about the steps required to transition from Phase 1, a temporary ceasefire, to Phase 2, a permanent end to the fighting and a release of the remaining living hostages. The official, who asked not to be identified because of the sensitivities of the negotiations, compared the current situation to the deal that was eventually reached in November that led to a ceasefire for several weeks and the release of some 105 hostages. He said a framework is now in place for a truce, but that there was still more to do to reach a final deal. The shift followed Hamas's announcement on Wednesday that it had exchanged some ideas with the mediators on the ceasefire deal after weeks of deadlock. An Israeli official who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss the sensitive talks said on Wednesday night that wide gaps between the sides remained, but that Hamas's revised position left potential to move forward in the talks. David Barnea, the head of the Israeli Mossad intelligence agency, will lead the Israeli negotiating team in Qatar as soon as Friday, said a second Israeli official and another official familiar with the talks. Many obstacles remain, including the question of whether Mr. Netanyahu will risk his right-wing coalition in agreeing to a ceasefire with Hamas. Two of his far-right coalition partners have insisted that the war against Hamas continue, potentially forcing Mr. Netanyahu to choose between a deal that ends the war and frees the hostages and the survival of his government. Mr. Netanyahu's office said the Prime Minister reiterated in his call with Mr. Biden on Thursday evening that Israel would end the war only after achieving its goals. Israel's stated goals include destroying Hamas's military and governing capabilities in the Gaza Strip, and ensuring that the Palestinian enclave cannot again pose a threat. Both aims could still take substantial time to achieve, if at all. The ceasefire talks had ground to a halt in June. After Mr. Biden announced the proposal, Hamas demanded amendments, leading Israel to quickly declare that Hamas had rejected the deal. The Biden administration said that some of Hamas's demands were unworkable. The White House, in a statement on Thursday, said that Mr. Biden welcomed the Prime Minister's decision to authorize his negotiators to engage with U.S., Qatari, and Egyptian mediators in an effort to close out the deal, but made no mention of Israeli caveats. Efforts to revive the negotiations came amid simmering tensions along Israel's northern border, with the Lebanese armed group Hezbollah launching an unusually large rocket and drone attack toward Israel on Wednesday and an even bigger one on Thursday in retaliation for Israel's killing of a Hezbollah commander on Wednesday. The rocket barrage killed one Israeli reservist officer and sparked wildfires along Israel's northern border. The main stumbling blocks in the Gaza talks have been related to a fundamental dispute. Hamas wants guarantees that the deal would lead to an end to the war and a full withdrawal of Israeli forces, while Israeli leaders have vowed to keep fighting until Hamas is destroyed and to keep post-war security control of Gaza in Israeli hands. According to two senior officials briefed on the talks, recent disagreement had largely centered on two paragraphs in the proposed agreement, both related to negotiations on a permanent truce. Those negotiations would take place during the first phase of the deal, a proposed 6-week ceasefire, during which some hostages would be exchanged for Palestinian prisoners. Hamas wanted to limit those talks to the number and identity of Palestinian prisoners to be released for each remaining hostage, while Israel wanted to leave it open-ended, so more topics could be added to the discussions, according to the two senior officials. Hamas feared Israel might torpedo the talks by expanding them to deal with other effectively unresolvable issues, which would allow Israel to continue the war, the officials said. Qatari negotiators offered Hamas 3 potential alternatives last week, according to two senior officials, though they did not give further details. The proposal also stipulates that if Israel and Hamas cannot reach a deal on a permanent ceasefire before the 6-week truce expires, negotiations will continue until they do. Two senior officials said Hamas wanted language that guaranteed Israel could not unilaterally declare that the talks had collapsed and return to battle. Some influential members of Mr. Netanyahu's coalition government have expressed opposition to a potential deal with Hamas. Now is not the time to stop. It is entirely the opposite. It is the time to bring in more forces and increase our military pressure, Bezalel Smotrich, the country's far-right finance minister, said on Tuesday. It would be absurd if we were to stop just a moment before success, the end, total victory over Hamas. The Biden administration hopes that a truce in Gaza will allow Israel and Hezbollah, which has been firing at Israel in solidarity with Hamas, to reach a diplomatic settlement as well. On Thursday, Hezbollah launched one of the largest attacks on northern Israel since the war in Gaza began, triggering air raid sirens across the area for over an hour and sending thousands running for fortified shelters. Roughly 200 rockets and mortars and 20 drones were launched into northern Israel, according to the Israeli military. Since the Hamas-led attack on Israel on October 7th, Hezbollah, the politically powerful Lebanese armed group, has repeatedly attacked northern Israel in solidarity with Hamas, prompting Israeli strikes in Lebanon. More than 150 people on both sides of the Israel-Lebanon border have fled, with little idea of when they might return home. Hezbollah said Thursday's barrage was partly a response to Israel's assassination of a senior Hezbollah military commander the previous day in the region of Tyre in southern Lebanon. But the Hezbollah munitions were mostly fired on border areas, avoiding a broader attack on Israel's heartland that would most likely have provoked a more severe response. Hezbollah has said that its forces will not stop their attacks until Israel ends its military campaign in Gaza. At the same time, Israeli officials have voiced increasingly bellicose threats of a potential invasion of Lebanon to push Hezbollah away from the border. Starmer becomes UK Prime Minister after Labour Party landslide. Labour's resounding election victory ended 14 years of Conservative government. A fragmented vote saw the Conservatives crash to the worst result in their long history. Here's the latest in Britain's election. Prime Minister Keir Starmer took office in Britain on Friday after his left-centre Labour Party won a landslide election victory, sweeping the Conservatives out of power after 14 years in an anti-incumbent revolt that heralded a new era in the nation's politics. Mr. Starmer met at Buckingham Palace with King Charles III and then delivered a speech outside No. 10 Downing Street, saying Britons had voted decisively for change and calling on the country to move forward together. Hours earlier, the departing Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, gave brief conciliatory remarks in Downing Street, congratulating Mr. Starmer, accepting responsibility for his party's resounding defeat, and saying to voters that he had heard your anger. With almost all 650 races declared, Labour had won more than 410 seats, and the Conservatives were on course for fewer than 130. That would be the worst defeat for the Conservatives in the nearly 200-year history of the party. But it was also an exceptionally fragmented result, with gains not only for Reform UK, an anti-immigrant party, but for the Green Party and for pro-Palestinian independent candidates in formerly safe Labour seats. The BBC estimated Labour's nationwide share of the vote at about 35%. That would be the lowest share of the vote won by any single-party majority government, according to Professor John Curtis, a polling expert. Here's what else to know. Unhappy electorate. Voter turnout was predicted to be at 60%, close to a record low, in a shift that appeared to reflect disillusionment with politics. Many Britons are skeptical of the government's ability to fix the ailing National Health Service, revive a torpid economy, and shore up public services, which have faced deep cuts over the last decade. Labour's makeover. For Mr. Starmer, a low-key lawyer who only entered Parliament in 2015, it was a remarkable vindication of his 4-year project to pull the Labour Party away from the left-wing policies of his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, and rebrand it as a plausible alternative to the increasingly erratic rule of the Conservatives. Sunak's future. Mr. Sunak said he would resign as party leader, not immediately, but once arrangements to choose his successor were in place. He offered a robust case for his achievements in less than 2 years in office, cutting inflation, resolving a trade dispute with the European Union, and steadying Britain's economy. Right-wing ferment. Reform UK's strong showing was a victory for Nigel Farage, the party's leader and veteran political disruptor who won a seat after failing in 7 previous bids to get into Parliament. From his new perch, Mr. Farage could try to poach the remnants of the debilitated Conservatives. Major Democratic donors devise plans to pressure Biden to step aside. The president appears intent on remaining on the ballot, while wealthy donors are discussing plans to put their money elsewhere. By Kenneth P. Vogel, Theodore Schleifer, and Lauren Hirsch. After several days of quiet griping and hoping that President Biden would abandon his re-election campaign on his own, many wealthy Democratic donors are trying to take matters into their own hands. Wielding their fortunes as both carrot and stick, donors have undertaken a number of initiatives to pressure Mr. Biden to step down from the top of the ticket and help lay the groundwork for an alternate candidate. The efforts, some coordinated, some conflicting, and others still nascent, expose a remarkable and growing rift between the party's contributor class and its standard-bearer that could have an impact on down-ballot races, whether or not the donors influence Mr. Biden's decision. The president on Wednesday reaffirmed his commitment to stay in the race amid criticism of his weak debate performance last week, but that has not placated donors or strategists who worry that he cannot win in November. A group of them is working to raise as much as $100 million for a sort of escrow fund called the Next Generation PAC that would be used to support a replacement candidate. If Mr. Biden does not step aside, the money could be used to help down-ballot candidates, according to people close to the effort. Supporters of potential replacements like Vice President Kamala Harris are jockeying to position their preferred successor. Other donors are threatening to withhold contributions, not only from Mr. Biden, but also from other Democratic groups unless Biden bows out. There is a separate movement to steer money to candidates for lower offices, and financial supporters are urging elected officials at all levels to publicly pressure Mr. Biden to withdraw, signaling support for those who follow through. Some major donors like Reed Hastings have gone public with calls for Mr. Biden to stand down. Gideon Stein, a donor and operative with deep connections in Democratic politics, said his family was withholding $3.5 million in planned donations to nonprofits and political organizations active in the presidential race, unless Mr. Biden stepped aside. He said that virtually every major donor he has spoken with believed that a new ticket is in the best interest of defeating Donald Trump. Abigail E. Disney, a filmmaker who is an heir to the Disney fortune, said in an email exchange that Mr. Biden's campaign and committees supporting it, including the Democratic National Committee, super PACs, and nonprofit groups, will not receive another dime from me until they bite the bullet and replace Biden at the top of the ticket. Ms. Disney, who has been a major Democratic donor, added, "Biden is a good man who has served his country well, but the stakes are far too high to allow timidity to determine our course of action." Damon Lindelof, a Hollywood producer who has donated more than $115,000 to Democrats this election cycle and who attended Mr. Biden's fundraiser in Hollywood last month, published an essay in Deadline urging what he called a dembargo of Mr. Biden and other Democratic candidates until or unless Mr. Biden stands down. Lindelof said in a text message exchange, "No one is eager to donate to anyone until the proverbial dust settles." The financial pressure campaign comes as Mr. Biden and his team have sought to reassure Democratic donors and officials that he is up to the task, privately telling key allies that he knows the coming days are crucial and acknowledging that he may not be able to salvage his candidacy. If Mr. Biden forges ahead, it could set up a dramatic impasse with a major donor base at the moment it is most needed, when the race enters its heavy spending home stretch. While Mr. Biden narrowly outraised Donald J. Trump last month, it is not clear if he erased the financial advantage that Mr. Trump and his party held over Mr. Biden and his party at the beginning of June. The surge in donations to Mr. Biden's campaign after the debate was powered mostly by online donations, which tend to come from smaller donors, though he also attended a handful of pre-planned fundraising receptions with major donors. Not all big donors are jumping ship. Some of the ticket's wealthy backers, even those who want a different candidate, said they were still writing checks, if begrudgingly. Still, some Democrats are concerned about the rate of big money fundraising. No fundraisers feature Mr. Biden until a Denver event at the end of the month, according to a recent list of events distributed to major Biden donors, although more may be added. But many big donors are seeking a way to move on and build a financial infrastructure for a post-Biden campaign. This is something unique, said James Carville, the longtime Democratic strategist. He added that he had encouraged donors to refuse fundraising calls from Democratic campaign groups and that the unfolding situation differed from donor revolts in past campaigns, when the contributors would complain, but for the most part, you sit down and you listen and you take notes and then you just tell them yes and then do nothing and everything is fine. Many anxious Biden megadonors are staying quiet publicly, skittish about being seen as being involved in a big money coup. Instead, several said in interviews that they were shifting their giving to buffer candidates for Congress and state offices from damage that could result from concerns about the top of the ticket. "You have to keep funding the machine," said Andrew E. Beck III, a retired finance executive who has donated more than $100,000 to Mr. Biden's campaign, and the DNC. Mr. Beck, who goes by Trey, signed a statement released Wednesday by a coalition of business executives urging Mr. Biden to stand down, and also has worked privately to persuade Democratic elected officials to publicly call for that result. But of all the efforts by wealthy Democrats, perhaps none is as ambitious as the Next Generation PAC, which plans to create a holding account to support a successor to Mr. Biden atop the Democratic ticket. Multiple proposals to set aside some money for a Democratic candidate not named Joe Biden have gained steam among leaders on Wall Street and in Silicon Valley, according to 4 people familiar with the conversations. The new PAC effort is spearheaded by Mike Novogratz, the cryptocurrency billionaire who backed Dean Phillips in the Democratic primary, his aides, and the Hollywood filmmaker Andrew Jarecki, according to 3 people briefed on the plan, with likely support from the Movement Voter Project. Next Generation PAC, which had not filed federal paperwork as of Thursday afternoon, has told donors it is seeking to raise between $50 million and $100 million, but is not planned to officially start until some money is in. This Anybody But Biden group intends to hold on to the money until either Mr. Biden steps down as the nominee or the Democratic National Convention concludes, according to materials distributed to donors and reviewed by the New York Times. If Mr. Biden were to leave, the PAC would spend money on ads for the new nominee and against Mr. Trump. If Mr. Biden remains the nominee, the group says it will spend the cash by helping other Democrats. People connected to the Biden team have caught wind of this stealth project and tried to talk some involved out of joining it, according to one of the people. The donors and strategists did not return requests for comment. Some of these efforts could redound to the benefit of Ms. Harris, who has faced skepticism from some major donors, but whose allies are now privately consolidating some support from ultra-rich donors and their big money operatives, according to interviews and internal memos. People close to Ms. Harris have reached out to influential business leaders to assess how she could go about building her donor base, according to 2 people familiar with the outreach. If Mr. Biden were to step aside and be replaced by Ms. Harris, she could inherit the campaign's money, which stood at $212 million at the beginning of last month. If another candidate were to become the nominee, the process could become more complicated, potentially requiring the funds to be transferred to the DNC or an independent group. Some Democratic megadonors have told the Biden campaign directly that they are in favor of a candidate swap, according to one fundraiser who has relayed that message. Others have asked where the money would go if he were to step down. We are fully planning for President Biden to be the nominee, but the majority of the money raised through the Biden Victory Fund goes to the DNC, which supports all Democrats on the ballot, one mid-level campaign staff member told a group of donors, according to a person who shared the written message. A few Harris supporters are nevertheless ready to speak out publicly. We are primed and ready to support a Harris ticket, said John Haynes, who led the National Finance Committee of Ms. Harris's 2020 campaign. Mr. Haynes said he supported Mr. Biden, but that if he opted not to run, there is no question that she's ready to be the president. Raymond J. McGuire, the president of the financial firm Lazard, called Ms. Harris singularly capable of bringing this nation together by crossing every divide. Her candidacy is compelling, he said. As of now, it does not exist. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. As Beryl moves on, ravaged islands assess the devastation. The hurricane caused destruction across the Caribbean, but some were relieved it hadn't been worse. By Jovan Johnson, Emiliano Rodriguez Mega, and Eric Nagorny. Hurricane Beryl, which tore through the eastern Caribbean this week, leaving islands flattened, communities inundated, and at least 8 people dead, made landfall again early Friday morning in Mexico, just northeast of Tulum on the Yucatan Peninsula. The storm, which this week became the earliest Category 5 hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic, weakened early Friday, dropping to Category 2 with maximum sustained winds up to 110 miles an hour, according to the National Hurricane Center. With the center forecasting dangerous storm surges and hurricane-force winds, the Mexican authorities were taking no chances. The government said on Thursday that it had deployed more than 13,000 workers and members of the armed forces along with rescue dogs and had set up mobile kitchens and water treatment plants in Quintana Roo, a southern state facing the Caribbean that may be the first to feel the storm's impact. After the hurricane moved on from Jamaica, residents emerged from shelters there to take in a landscape of farmland that had been devastated, homes that had sustained damage, and roads that were covered with toppled utility poles and foliage. The whole place mash up, Steve Taylor, a resident of the low-lying coastal town of Mitchelltown, told a local television station. St. Elizabeth, a farming region known as the country's breadbasket, was hit particularly hard. Southwest St. Elizabeth is facing complete devastation, said Jamaica's Agriculture Minister Floyd Green. Still, as brutal as Hurricane Beryl was, Jamaican officials surveying the destruction said it could have been still worse. The damage was not what we had expected, and so we're very grateful for that, Prime Minister Andrew Holness told CNN on Thursday. I think Jamaica was spared the worst. So far, officials said, the storm appeared to have taken few lives in the Caribbean since first making landfall Monday in Grenada. Forecasters were predicting that Mexico would be hit not just once, but twice by the hurricane. It was on track to cross the Yucatan Peninsula on Friday, and then, after traversing the Gulf of Mexico, reach the coast of the northern state of Tamaulipas. Some evacuations were underway in Tulum and Felipe Carrillo Puerto, areas that officials feared would face the brunt of the storm's force. In Cancun, a popular vacation spot, yachts were clustered in an inland waterway for protection. Anders Asen and his family arrived on Thursday at Mexico's Cancun International Airport after traveling almost 24 hours from Norway, unaware that a hurricane was also arriving there in a matter of hours. At the hotel, they haven't given us any information about what will happen or what we have to do, said Mr. Asen, 42, an entrepreneur who planned to travel to Cancun and Tulum with his wife and 3 children. He said the family had already spent $20,000 on their trip. Most of the tourists who arrived at the airport on Thursday said they had not been informed in advance about the storm and added that neither travel agencies nor hotels had notified them about safety measures. In the Gulf of Mexico, Shell Oil said it was evacuating non-essential workers from a floating oil platform. The platform, called Perdido, sits about 200 miles south of Galveston, Texas, in about 8,000 feet of water. The company said there were no other impacts on our production from the hurricane. The storm emerged as the earliest Category 5 hurricane on record in the Atlantic Ocean, according to Philip Klotzbach, a meteorologist at Colorado State University who specializes in tropical cyclones. The previous record was set by Hurricane Emily on July 17, 2005, he said. Meteorologists say that Hurricane Beryl's quick escalation was a direct result of above-average sea surface temperatures and a harbinger of what may be an especially difficult hurricane season. Residents in the Cayman Islands were largely breathing a sigh of relief after Hurricane Beryl passed by at Category 3 strength on Thursday morning without making landfall. There were no reports of significant damage, injuries, or fatalities. Officials said, however, that they were still assessing the storm's full effects. In Jamaica, power and water supplies were slowly being restored to the areas hard hit. The eastern and southern parishes of Kingston, the capital, Portland, and other neighborhoods. More than 60% of customers were without water and light as of Thursday morning, representatives of the main providers told local news media. Mobile phone service was still unavailable in large parts of the country. Jamaica's Sangster International Airport in the tourism area of Montego Bay was expected to reopen later on Thursday, the transport minister said in a statement. The main airport, Norman Manley, remained closed for repairs but was expected to reopen on Friday. The government said public sector workers could return to work, while some commercial institutions have called in their employees. Jamaica's central bank advised that it would remain closed until Friday. Schools have shut for the summer. Rebuilding appeared to be a far more arduous task on islands that were hit even harder by the storm, especially in Grenada. Satellite imagery showed flattened houses and buildings without roofs, with the islands of Carriacou and Petite Martinique bearing the brunt of the damage. Officials said roughly 98% of the buildings there had been destroyed. In Argyle, a popular tourist town with dozens of vacation rentals in Carriacou, before and after images showed structures reduced to rubble. The island's docks, usually filled with boats, were empty. Along the northeast coastline of Carriacou, damage continued far inland, satellite imagery showed. Tourism is one of the island's main sources of income, and the airport and some hotels were reopening as cleanup operations began, the Grenada Hotel and Tourism Association said. A hacker stole OpenAI secrets, raising fears that China could too. A security breach at the maker of ChatGPT last year revealed internal discussions among researchers and other employees, but not the code behind OpenAI's systems. By Cade Metz. Early last year, a hacker gained access to the internal messaging systems of OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPT, and stole details about the design of the company's AI technologies. The hacker lifted details from discussions in an online forum where employees talked about OpenAI's latest technologies, according to two people familiar with the incident, but did not get into the systems where the company houses and builds its artificial intelligence. OpenAI executives revealed the incident to employees during an all-hands meeting at the company's San Francisco offices in April 2023 and informed its board of directors, according to the two people who discussed sensitive information about the company on the condition of anonymity. But the executives decided not to share the news publicly because no information about customers or partners had been stolen, the two people said. The executives did not consider the incident a threat to national security because they believed the hacker was a private individual with no known ties to a foreign government. The company did not inform the FBI or anyone else in law enforcement. For some OpenAI employees, the news raised fears that foreign adversaries such as China could steal AI technology that, while now mostly a work and research tool, could eventually endanger U.S. national security. It also led to questions about how seriously OpenAI was treating security and exposed fractures inside the company about risks of artificial intelligence. After the breach, Leopold Aschenbrenner, an OpenAI technical program manager focused on ensuring that future AI technologies do not cause serious harm, sent a memo to OpenAI's board of directors arguing that the company was not doing enough to prevent the Chinese government and other adversaries from stealing its secrets. Mr. Aschenbrenner said OpenAI had fired him this spring for leaking the information outside the company and argued that his dismissal had been politically motivated. He alluded to the breach on a recent podcast, but details of the incident have not been previously reported. He said OpenAI's security wasn't strong enough to protect against the theft of key secrets if foreign actors were to infiltrate the company. We appreciate the concerns Leopold raised while at OpenAI, and this did not lead to his separation, an OpenAI spokeswoman, Liz Bourgeois, said. Referring to the company's efforts to build artificial general intelligence, a machine that can do anything the human brain can do, she added, "While we share this commitment to building safe AGI, we disagree with many of the claims he has since made about our work. This includes his characterizations of our security, notably this incident, which we addressed and shared with our board before he joined the company." Fears that a hack of an American technology company might have links to China are not unreasonable. Last month, Brad Smith, Microsoft's president, testified on Capitol Hill about how Chinese hackers used the tech giant's systems to launch a wide-ranging attack on federal government networks. However, under federal and California law, OpenAI cannot prevent people from working at the company because of their nationality, and policy researchers have said that barring foreign talent from U.S. projects could significantly impede the progress of AI in the United States. "We need the best and the brightest minds working on this technology," Matt Knight, OpenAI's head of security, told the New York Times in an interview. "It comes with some risks, and we need to figure those out." The Times has sued OpenAI and its partner Microsoft, claiming copyright infringement of news content related to AI systems. OpenAI is not the only company building increasingly powerful systems using rapidly improving AI technology. Some of them, most notably Meta, the owner of Facebook and Instagram, are freely sharing their designs with the rest of the world as open-source software. They believe that the dangers posed by today's AI technologies are slim, and that sharing code allows engineers and researchers across the industry to identify and fix problems. Today's AI systems can help spread disinformation online, including text, still images, and increasingly videos. They are also beginning to take away some jobs. Companies like OpenAI and its competitors, Anthropic and Google, add guardrails to their AI applications before offering them to individuals and businesses, hoping to prevent people from using the apps to spread disinformation or cause other problems. But there is not much evidence that today's AI technologies are a significant national security risk. Studies by OpenAI, Anthropic, and others over the past year showed that AI was not significantly more dangerous than search engines. Daniela Amodei, an Anthropic co-founder and the company's president, said its latest AI technology would not be a major risk if its designs were stolen or freely shared with others. If it were owned by someone else, could that be hugely harmful to a lot of society? Our answer is no, probably not, she told the Times last month. Could it accelerate something for a bad actor down the road? Maybe. It is really speculative. Still, researchers and tech executives have long worried that AI could one day fuel the creation of new bioweapons or help break into government computer systems. Some even believe it could destroy humanity. A number of companies, including OpenAI and Anthropic, are already locking down their technical operations. OpenAI recently created a safety and security committee to explore how it should handle the risks posed by future technologies. The committee includes Paul Nakasone, a former Army general who led the National Security Agency and Cyber Command. He has also been appointed to the OpenAI board of directors. "We started investing in security years before ChatGPT," Mr. Knight said. "We're on a journey not only to understand the risks and stay ahead of them, but also to deepen our resilience." Federal officials and state lawmakers are also pushing toward government regulations that would bar companies from releasing certain AI technologies and fine them millions if their technologies cause harm. But experts say these dangers are still years or even decades away. Chinese companies are building systems of their own that are nearly as powerful as the leading U.S. systems. By some metrics, China eclipsed the United States as the biggest producer of AI talent, with the country generating almost half the world's top AI researchers. It is not crazy to think that China will soon be ahead of the U.S. said Clement Delange, chief executive of Hugging Face, a company that hosts many of the world's open-source AI projects. Some researchers and national security leaders argue that the mathematical algorithms at the heart of current AI systems, while not dangerous today, could become dangerous and are calling for tighter controls on AI labs. Even if the worst-case scenarios are relatively low probability, if they are high impact, then it is our responsibility to take them seriously, Susan Rice, former domestic policy advisor to President Biden and former national security advisor for President Barack Obama, said during an event in Silicon Valley last month. I do not think it is science fiction, as many like to claim. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. New York's first Black librarians changed the way we read. How the women who ran libraries during the Harlem Renaissance built collections and, just as important, communities of writers and readers, by Jennifer Schuessler. It was a banner day in the history of American libraries and in Black history. On May 25, 1926, the New York Public Library announced that it had acquired the celebrated Afro-Latino bibliophile Arturo Schomburg's collection of more than 4,000 books, manuscripts, and other artifacts. A year earlier, the library had established the first public collection dedicated to Black materials at its 135th Street branch in Harlem. Now, the branch would be home to a trove of rare items, from some of the earliest books by and about Black people to then-new works of the brewing Harlem Renaissance. Schomburg was the most famous of the Black bibliophiles, who, starting in the late 19th century, had amassed impressive parlor libraries in their homes. Such libraries became important gathering places for Black writers and thinkers at a time when newly created public libraries, which exploded in number in the decades after 1870, were uninterested in Black materials and often unwelcoming of Black patrons. Schomburg summed up his credo in a famous 1925 essay, writing, "The American Negro must remake his past in order to make his future." In a 1913 letter, he had put it less decorously. The items in his library were powder with which to fight our enemies. But powder needs someone to load it. That is, books need librarians. Today, figures like Schomburg and the historian and activist W.E.B. Du Bois, another collector and compiler of Black books, are hailed as the founders of the 20th century Black intellectual tradition. But increasingly, scholars are also uncovering the important role of the women who often ran the libraries, where they built collections and, just as important, communities of readers. Mr. Schomburg's collection is really the seed, said Joy Bivens, the current director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, as the 135th Street Library, currently home to more than 11 million items, is now known. But in many ways, it is these women who were the institution builders. Many were among the first Black women to attend library school, where they learned the tools and the systems of the rapidly professionalizing field. On the job, they learned these tools weren't always suited to Black books and ideas, so they invented their own. At times, they battled overt and covert censorship that would be familiar in today's climate of rising book bans and restrictions on teaching so-called divisive concepts. But whether they worked in world-famous research collections or modest public branch libraries, these pioneers saw their role as not just about tending old books, but also about making room for new people and new ideas. These librarians were very tuned in and understood that a cultural movement also needs a space, said Laura E. Helton, a historian at the University of Delaware and author of the recent book Scattered and Fugitive Things: How Black Collectors Created Archives and Remade History. And libraries served that function in every town and city where they were set up. Initially, those librarians were stepping into what might have seemed like a void. In the 1920 census, only 69 of the 15,297 Americans who listed their profession as librarian were Black. Many cities in the segregated South had no library services at all for Black citizens, and even in the North, those branches that did serve them often had few books geared to their interests, and sometimes no card catalogs or reference collections at all. That started to change, if slowly. In 1924 in Chicago, Vivian Harsh became the first black librarian to lead a public library branch there. Later, as head of the city's first branch in a black neighborhood, which opened in Bronzeville in 1932, she welcomed Black history study groups and established the nation's second public library collection dedicated to Black life and literature. No place captures the transformations of the era more than Harlem, where starting in 1920, a white librarian named Ernestine Rose hired 4 young black librarians at the 135th Street Library, which had recently become the city's unofficial colored branch. The poet Arne Bontemps, who himself later became a librarian, recalled visiting the 135th Street Library after his arrival in Harlem in 1924. There were a couple of very nice-looking girls sitting at the desk. Colored girls, he said. I had never seen that before. Nella Larson, the author of the 1929 novel Passing and the first black graduate of the New York Public Library's library school, worked there for a time. And other girls at the branch fostered the neighborhood's artistic ferment in different ways. Among them was Regina Andrews, a young librarian from Chicago, where she was mentored by Harsh, who came to New York City on vacation in 1922 and decided to stay. She started at 135th Street in 1923 and soon settled into an apartment at 580 St. Nichols Avenue with 2 friends who worked at Opportunity, a new magazine that aimed to capture the creative ferment bubbling up in Harlem. Nicknamed Dream Haven, the apartment quickly became a salon and crash pad for some of the most celebrated figures of the period. It was there that Alain Locke held some planning meetings for the special issue of the Survey Graphic magazine that later grew into his landmark 1925 anthology, The New Negro. And it was there that many black artists and writers who attended the 1924 Civic Club dinner, now recognized as the opening bell of the Harlem Renaissance, gathered for an after-party capped off with bacon and eggs. The spirit of sociability extended to Andrews' life at the library, where she helped set up space for writers like Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and others to work, and also joined a theatrical troupe that Du Bois had founded in the basement. She was a connector, said Etheline Whitmire, a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and author of a 2014 biography of Andrews, who retired from the library system in 1966. She wasn't there to take credit, but to work behind the scenes. For black librarians of the period, librarianship wasn't just about hosting writers or connecting books with patrons. It was also about creating an intellectual infrastructure that made black materials visible and findable in the first place. At 135th Street, one of Andrews' colleagues was Catherine Latimer, who in 1925 became the first curator of the newly established Division of Negro Literature, History, and Prints, which welcomed Schomburg's collection the following year. If Schomburg's books were powder, the librarian's tools were more banal items like scissors, note cards, and filing cabinets. In a 1934 article in The Crisis, the official magazine of the NAACP, called Where Can I Get Material About the Negro, Latimer described the riches of the collection at 135th Street. But she was also thinking about how to find things once you were there. Working in parallel with Dorothy Porter, a librarian at Howard University, Latimer created an index of black poetry and song, with each entry listed by name and first line. Porter's version was lost, but Helton located Latimer's several years ago in storage rooms of the Schomburg. Like many librarians, Latimer also maintained a newspaper clipping file, where she preserved and organized the voluminous record of social and cultural life found in the vibrant black press. Making indexes, creating catalogs, and compiling scrapbooks may be less glamorous than holding salons and throwing literary parties, but it was equally crucial, Helton argues, to the period's black information explosion, as Porter once called it. Librarianship was connected with forms of domestic work, with keeping things organized and tidy, Helton said, but that masks the incredible intellectual labor at the heart of librarianship. For black librarians, Helton notes, the work of cataloging often meant counter-cataloging. As black collections moved from private homes to institutions, quirky personal systems, Schomburg had shelved his own books by color and spine height, no longer sufficed. But neither, some librarians found, did the purportedly scientific information systems used in most libraries, which allowed limited space for non-European subjects. Today, Porter, who became the chief librarian of Howard in 1930, is remembered as the pioneering architect of one of the world's premier Africana research centers, who hunted down forgotten manuscripts and built connections between the African American experience and global Black networks. But building Howard's collection and making it useful to users also meant doing battle with inadequate classification systems. Working with Latimer and others, she tweaked the Library of Congress's standard subject headings, adding ones for subjects like passing, Pan-Africanism, and the blues. She also took on the racism baked into the Dewey Decimal Classification system. That system, first devised in the 1870s, divided the world and all knowledge of it into categories of race, culture, and religion. In practice, it wedged all of Black experience into a tiny numerical slice of the universe. In most libraries, Helton notes, librarians tend to shelve everything Black, whether works of poetry or sociological texts, into two locations, 326 for slavery and 325.26, a subclassification of colonization and migration dedicated to the Negro question. Porter started tweaking the system in ways that also powerfully reconceptualized the world. For example, under the Dewey system, American history was organized largely around wars and presidencies. But Porter rethought that approach, replacing Andrew Johnson's presidency into emancipation, Rutherford B. Hayes as Ku Klux Klan, and so on. In Porter's library, Helton writes in her book, the struggle for Black freedom was the engine of historical change. When Porter tried to share her tweaked Dewey system with other Black collections, she was warned she might be charged with copyright infringement of the Dewey system. Still, an unauthorized version was adopted at the Schomburg and elsewhere. Those early librarians were really instrumental in correcting the record so people could actually find what they were looking for, Bivens said. It's really hard to find a book about Africa when it's buried in travel, even though it's actually a history book or an ethnographic study. In many places across the country, particularly in the segregated South, Black librarians and Black readers found themselves stymied by far blunter forces than the faulty Dewey Decimal categories. Often, the white central librarians who controlled Black branches forbade overly radical texts or too many Black books in one place, period. In Roanoke, Virginia, which in 1921 had opened one of the first branch libraries for Black readers in the South, a young librarian named Virginia Lee established a Jessie Fawcett Reading Club, one of the many Black literary groups that sprung up across the country that decade, named for a Harlem Renaissance figure, and quietly started assembling a collection of several hundred books by and about the Negro. The books weren't given any fanfare as a special collection. Still, at some point in the 1940s, Lee was told to remove them or lose her job. Instead, she took them into the basement where she would fetch them quietly on request. To save the collection, Helton writes in her book, Lee took it underground. Today, the outlook is very different. Black librarians occupy some of the top jobs in the profession, starting with the Librarian of Congress, Carla Hayden. Black material is highly sought after by deep-pocketed white-led institutions that, when Schomburg started his book hunting, largely ignored it. But even the collections formed by Schomburg and other pioneers still hold many unknown and unnoticed things. There's still stuff left to discover, said Kevin Young, a former special collections curator at Emory University and director of the Schomburg, who now leads the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington. Librarians do that in big and small ways every day. Still, Black librarians face challenges, starting with their underrepresentation in the field, where they make up only about 7%. They are also often at the forefront of fighting efforts to ban books about race that are viewed as controversial, or even just novels by authors like Toni Morrison. Tracy D. Hall, who from 2020 to 2023 served as the first female Black executive director of the American Library Association, started her career in the 1990s at the Seattle Public Library, where she created its first reading guide for contemporary African American literature. At the Library Association, she found herself leading the charge against surging book bans and cuts to library funding, which hit low-income communities and patrons of color particularly hard. Librarians, she believes, need to be warriors, and Black librarians especially. Because there are so few of us, our work has to be of consequence, she said. For those entering the field, she said, even if you are not propelled by an activist streak, you will become an activist. This service cat has a big job, the apocalypse. The director of A Quiet Place Day One was confident a cat could take on the end of the world, but could the feline actors win over Lupita Nyong'o? By Esther Zuckerman. How did a cat named Schnitzel win the starring role of Frodo in A Quiet Place Day One? He impressed the director Michael Sarnowski with his nonchalant confidence, rugged looks, and intelligent face. He had a lot going on behind his eyes, Sarnowski said in an interview last week when the film made its theatrical debut. A lot of the other cats were really adorable, but almost too cutesy, like they would be in a cat food commercial. And Schnitzel had a little bit of an edge, like you could kind of believe he was a bit of a world-weary street cat. Frodo has a lot to be weary about in this cinematic universe. The film, a prequel to the 2018 horror movie A Quiet Place and its 2021 sequel, chronicles aliens invading Earth and attacking everything that makes sound. Lupita Nyong'o plays Sam, a cancer patient caught in the apocalypse with her service cat while visiting New York. Though most people want to escape Manhattan, Sam knows she is dying regardless and just wants to go to Harlem where she grew up and grab a slice of pizza. She meets a British law student named Eric, Joseph Quinn, who agrees to join her, and the cat becomes a comfort to them both. Sam is a poet, hence Frodo's literary name, and spoiler warning, audiences will be happy to know Frodo makes it out alive. Sarnowski, who also wrote the screenplay, grew up with cats and knew he wanted Sam to have an animal companion. But the creature would need to be able to navigate an urban apocalypse in silence. A dog would bark at a threat, and something like a bunny, say, wouldn't fit in the grit of Manhattan. But it's common to see cats around the city wandering the streets or guarding delis. Frodo even meets a bodega cat, played by a ginger and white shorthair named Stanley, a runner-up for the lead role. A lot of people are like, why doesn't the cat make more noise? But cats are very smart, predatory creatures, Sarnowski said, adding that he believed the cat would recognize the danger and figure out how to survive. I figured a cat would have a shot. The film's budget included a computer-generated cat, but Sarnowski was dedicated to using the real thing. I think it makes you feel more connected, he said. You feel like they're a real character more. Schnitzel, who was previously in The Marvels, was one of several cats from the training company Birds and Animals UK who auditioned, which consisted of roaming around and just doing cat stuff. After Sarnowski settled on Schnitzel, another cat, Nico, whom Schnitzel has known since kittenhood, was also booked. His all-white fur was colored with semi-permanent animal-friendly dye to match Schnitzel's distinctive black and white markings. Schnitzel knew he was the hero cat, Sarnowski said, adding that he was the diva used for many of the close-ups. Nico was a little more like, yeah, I'll do what I gotta do. He was sort of like a stunt double. A stuffed version, deemed Frida, was used for scenes with more action. The trainer, Joe Vaughn, had about 12 weeks to prep the cats. A significant portion was spent familiarizing them with being carried and walking on leashes. If there's two things cats don't like, Vaughn said, one is being on a harness and lead, and two is being carried. The cats weren't the only ones who had to adapt to something they didn't like. When filming began, Nyong'o, who won an Oscar in 2014 for her role in 12 Years a Slave, was afraid of the creatures. Sarnowski said she spent about an hour before shooting each day doing cat time to get to know Schnitzel and Nico. Still, no matter their training, which also consisted of practicing water scenes in a pool designed for dogs, the cats decided what they were and were not willing to do. While shooting a scene in a flooded subway station in a water tank, Sarnowski said, one of the cats bailed from its makeshift raft. Joe Quinn, I think, was the one that swam to the cat and was like, "We'll get you out," he said. Another challenge was capturing a cat when the camera was in motion. If you're on a Steadicam following the cat, Sarnowski said, the cat's always going to be like, "What is that thing behind me?" Frodo remains cat-like throughout the film, occasionally becoming distracted and wandering off, but he comes to represent the human character's desire to protect one another. As a service cat, he offers Sam solace and provides it for the audience as well. It's easy to see why Nyong'o ultimately became a cat person, cuddling her furry co-stars. Once filming Wrapped and Nyong'o had to part with Schnitzel and Nico, she adopted a cat, who is orange and named Yo-Yo. Everyone should have a cat, Sarnowski said. He ended up getting one too. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Friday, July 5th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Chris. Thank you for listening.